Hello, I'm Terry Buffington. I am the author of Born Under Jim Crow. Some 60 years ago, the South and her people were, by all accounts, caught up in original Civil War. In the midst of it all was the state of Mississippi, with the likes of former Senator John E. Stennis and at the time Governor Paul Johnson. These two men battled to maintain the social order of Jim Crow legislation and white supremacy. Mississippi is known for its blues, its folklore, its literary artists, catfish, cotton, segregation, and beautiful magnolia trees, as well as the memories of racial and political unrest some 60 years later still lingers in its air. However, in good faith, the state of Mississippi has cast persuasive efforts, if you will, to eradicate its racial history. Still, the Magnolia State hangs on the edge of a slippery slope with ongoing collision of racial conflict. In spite of its reputation for being a central location for civil rights activism, she is still notorious for its uncompromising position on race and extreme insurgent. While the state is no longer a Jim Crow society, it has remained a place of strange fruit. In the state of Mississippi, the legal restrictions are gone, but Mississippi has mental signs that prevent minorities the opportunity to acquire upward mobility. What's more, Mississippi is a state with an inherent system of structural racism and policies that disproportionately punish black citizens. In my adopted community of Oxford, Mississippi, located in North Mississippi, home to the University of Mississippi, Ole Miss to be more precise, and the Ole Miss Rebels, and the literary great William Faulkner, Oxford is a small community of wealth with a demographic makeup of 85% white and 15% black. Oxford, Mississippi is located in the Mississippi Hill Country, as we call it. In the Hill Country, you had people like Tammy Wynette. The great country singer was a Mississippian. The young woman that recorded Ode to Billy Joe, Bobby Gentry, she was a Mississippian. We had one of the first Miss USA from Mississippi. And so Mississippi has a lot of greatness, if you will. We had Eudora Welty. We had the great Margaret Walker that wrote the famed Jubilee and For My People. All of these great people, Richard Wright, all of these great people were Mississippians, literary critics. So it wasn't the literary authors in Mississippi. They wrote about liberation and the dichotomy and the complexity of Mississippi. I had a professor that used to say Mississippi is really two states. You have the Mississippi on the racist side, and then you have the Mississippi on the more humane side, if you will. All Mississippians, at least most Mississippians, have a sense of place. What I mean by that is most of us as Mississippians has some form of identity that is deeply connected to the state, irregardless of the segregation and the racism. Mississippi people, and I think people in the southern region, has a sense of purpose, a sense of place, if you will. Mississippi, historically in Oxford, Mississippi, where you have a predominantly white community, Unlike the town that I grew up in a little town called West Point, Mississippi, which is about 100 miles southeast of Oxford. My hometown is a 45-minute drive from Tupelo, Mississippi, the birthplace of the legendary rocker Elvis Presley. So in the north part of the state, you have very few black people. We're looking at North Mississippi all the way up through Senatoria, Batesville, on up to the Tennessee line. And the reason for that is in North Mississippi, you didn't have cotton, so to speak. You didn't have an influx of black slaves, so to speak. In my part of the state where I grew up, in West Point was known as, and it is known as, the Black Prairie. The soil was so rich in the 19th century. It was so rich until cotton was king of the state of Mississippi. By the 1980s, unlike Oxford, Mississippi had over 500 enslaved black people. At the time, of course, Mississippi was a territory that borders on Alabama, Pickens County, Alabama. My town, West Point, is a former antebellum community where you had Columbus, Mississippi, which is the home to Mississippi University for Women, and you had Holly Springs, Mississippi, which is home to the historic black college, Russ College. It's in Holly Springs. And then you had West Point. We had a historic college that was Presbyterian, supported by the U.S. Presbyterian Church, which was Mayor Holmes College, one of the schools that I attended when I was 14 or 15 out of high school. And so Mississippi, in spite of all of these other things, in Oxford, is uniquely different. I always tell people, if you have to live in Mississippi, you want to be in some place like Oxford, where it's hip, the people are better educated, it's vibrant, it's a lively little enclave of wealth, if you will. In Oxford, on the town square, you have these fancy stores, you got fine dining, you have art galleries, a community theater, and a lively nightlife are the focus point of the town's social life. On any given day or evening, there are fewer than 5 black people on the town square up in Oxford, Mississippi. To explore the question of why, April of 2014, some young Ole Miss girls, they were journalist students from Ole Miss students, conducted a 3-hour survey of people coming and going about the square. The students reported that they saw fewer than 10 blacks. The Ole Miss student interviewed the town's mayor about the lack of diversity. He said, if there were a dollar store or a Family Dollar General out there, you would have a different demographics. He went on to say that there is a big diversity push right now, the mayor said. He said, and I think it's silly. For the most part, silly, the mayor told the News Watch 99, a University of Mississippi student-based media outlet. To pour gasoline on an already burning flame, several months later, the desecration of the James Meredith statue on the Ole Miss campus sent shock waves throughout the nation. Now, let me back up. James Meredith was the first black to enroll to integrate the University of Mississippi in 1962. In 1962, Mississippi was a heavily segregated state as it is today, except we don't have the Jim Crow laws, but in many ways we still live under the umbrella of a Jim Crow society. So that night, James Meredith enrolled in the University of Mississippi, and there was a riot on campus where several people were killed. President Kennedy at the time was in the White House. He and his brother Bobby. Bobby was the Attorney General. And the Kennedy administration sent National Guards out of the various states, just as Eisenhower had done in 1954 up in Little Rock, Arkansas, when the Kennedy sent National Guard troops into Arkansas so that the Arkansas 9 could register in the schools. Now imagine growing up in a location where you are a human being, you come from the ancestors of enslaved people that basically built America. No, basically, we built America. My ancestors did. But you were not allowed to go to school, to a decent school, should I say, and you were not allowed to drink out of the water fountain. When I was a girl growing up in West Point, Mississippi, under the Jim Crow era, as I passed white people on the streets, I was required to step off the sidewalk so that white people could pass by. That was what Jim Crow was about. Jim Crow was a character initially that started out in a minister show. You know how you go to these concerts or these Broadway shows, say Hamilton or The Color Purple or some of these other Cats, some of these other musical shows. Well, the minister shows were like that, and there were various characters, and they would travel the South. And one of the places that they would come and do a show, it was 2 nights, was in my hometown of West Point. I didn't know at the time that all of the actors and the characters that was in the theatrical part were white people with black faces. So this guy, Jim Crow character, would do a little dance and a little song, a little juggle, and it would say something to the effect, Jim Crow, do you want to jump? Jim Crow, do you want to jump? And he did this little wiggling and stiggling and grinning. So what Jim Crow was a invitation or the depiction of what white people perceive black people as being docile, silly, just uncouth, uncivilized, and half human. That's how we get the concept of race and segregation, and how white people view black Americans as less than they are. So Jim Crow later became a law. Jim Crow took the form of segregation. Now, you got to go back and know something about the history of the South. If you go back to the 1800s of the South, when Mississippi was a territory, the rule was initially, if you were white, a white male, if you will, you were allowed to vote. And then as the territory opened up and more settlers started to come into the Mississippi territory, then the laws changed. In order to vote that time, when they changed the laws, you had to be white and you had to be a property owner. So it eliminates the process for slaves at the time. We could not vote. We were still enslaved, living under the system of segregation. As time went on, the black Republicans of the state, we're still talking 19th century, the black Republicans, the radical Republicans as they are known in history, took over the state, and they became they were in control of what happened in America. So white people didn't like that, and the first organized group of white resistance came from the South, Natchez, Mississippi to be exact. And these white men got together, and they would control the community at night, and they would beat black people, and they used these scare tactics as they're doing today with voter registration and all of the new the elections that we're holding. Currently we're doing midterms, and so there was always been a level of intimidation to keep black people out. So as time went on and history changed, when the black Republicans was in charge of the government, so to speak, in fact they went to Washington, then became congressmen, and the white people in the South, trying to maintain their sense of place and their way of life, decided that that wasn't going to work. So they somehow we leading up to the Civil War now, they somehow decided that their life, their way of life is being threatened, and that was a no-no. So they became in control again. Then we had the Civil War, and after the Civil War is when the black people were in control of the center of the I need to stop this.